The penthouse was silent, a stark contrast to the celebratory noise that still echoed from the lower floors. Caleb stood before Julian, the man who owned every breath in his body. On the night of Julian's politically advantageous wedding, Caleb was on his knees before the marital bed. A foot, elegant and pale, lifted his chin. Julian's voice was a low murmur, asking if Caleb wished to serve him. Caleb's response was honest. He did. Julian leaned down, the scent of expensive cologne and champagne clinging to him. He patted Caleb's cheek, his touch a casual dismissal. He reminded Caleb that he was just a dog, a pet, and questioned if he was worthy of such a task. A wave of disappointment washed over Caleb, his eyes falling to the plush carpet. But then, Julian's languid voice cut through the silence again, amending his statement. He would allow it. Caleb's head snapped up, his heart leaping with a sudden, sharp joy. He could finally serve his master in the open. In his elation, he didn't see the kick coming. It sent him sprawling, and a heavy glass jar of scented lotion clattered to the floor beside him. Julian's voice was cold now, calling him an unobservant dog and ordering him to come and serve. He added a chilling threat that if Caleb caused him any pain, he would be sent to a place from which men did not return whole. The air in the private study was heavy, thick with unspoken tension. Caleb knelt, his head bowed, feeling the weight of Julian's gaze from the leather armchair where he sat. It was an assessing look, but laced with an unfamiliar heat that felt like a brand against his skin. Caleb took a steadying breath and confessed his failure. He had not detected Senator Sterling's unusual activities, and for that he requested punishment. Sterling was a powerful man with the governor's ear. A serpent Julian had long suspected of treachery. The soft sound of expensive shoes on hardwood floors grew closer. A cool hand touched Caleb's cheek, tracing a path down his jaw to his neck. A shiver traced its way down Caleb's spine, but he remained perfectly still, a statue of obedience as the fingers explored the line of his throat. Julian's voice commanded him to look up. As the hand withdrew, a phantom tingling remained. Caleb obediently raised his head. Julian's expression was strange, his normally playful eyes holding a deep, unsettling intensity. He decided that punishment was not necessary. Caleb frowned in confusion. Julian was known for his strict sense of justice. Seeing the question in Caleb's eyes, Julian offered a faint smile. He explained that someone certainly deserved to be punished, but it wasn't Caleb. He then inquired why it was Caleb, and not Leo, who had been assigned to surveillance at the exclusive downtown club Sterling frequented. The mission had been simple: watch Sterling at the Carmine Lounge. But Leo had complained the stakeout was boring and had convinced Caleb to take his place. Normally, Julian overlooked such minor swaps. This time, however, was different. Caleb felt a pang of guilt for his friend. After hearing the explanation, Julian's lips twisted into a cold sneer. He remarked on Leo's surprising laziness, taking issue with the fact that his direct orders were being delegated. Caleb tried to think of something to say in Leo's defense, but no words came. As he struggled, Julian's clear voice cut through his thoughts. He reminded Caleb that he belonged to him, and his orders were the only ones that mattered. He warned that this was the first and last time such a transgression would be tolerated. Caleb nodded, his voice firm as he swore it would never happen again. There were 12 members in Julian's elite security detail. Caleb was designated as 7. He'd grown up in the system, an orphan who never knew his parents, destined for a life of poverty and insignificance until Julian found him. He had never seen anyone so striking, like a figure from an old painting. Julian had told him to remember his name, Julian Croft, as he extended a hand. Without hesitation, Caleb had taken it. Julian was only a few years older, but he already carried an aura of immense power. He had pulled Caleb from the streets, sponsored his training, and erased his past. From that day on, Caleb had a purpose. Julian became his master. Julian called him his dog, and Caleb accepted the title. A dog's duty was to protect its master. If Julian pointed east, Caleb went east. If Julian wanted someone gone, Caleb's hand would be on his weapon. But the command Julian gave him now left him frozen. Julian asked if he hadn't heard him. Caleb shook his head quickly, his fingers fumbling with the buckle of his designer belt. When he stood naked, his body was tense, awaiting the next order. A playful smile touched Julian's lips as his eyes roamed over Caleb's form, finally settling on a particular area. He commented that Caleb seemed well-fed, but then his tone shifted, questioning if his dark complexion was natural or the result of use. Caleb's brow furrowed in confusion. After a moment of silence, he admitted his own foolishness and asked his master to clarify. This was not the first time Caleb's simple nature had failed to grasp Julian's layered meanings. Julian leaned in, his hand cool against the back of Caleb's neck, pulling him closer. The touch sent a jolt through Caleb, and he stammered his master's name. A soft laugh brushed against his ear as Julian's hold guided him to his knees. Julian then whispered his meaning directly into Caleb's ear, the warm breath and soft words sending a hot shock through Caleb's entire body. He felt his throat tighten. He stammered that he had never used it. Julian expressed his belief that Caleb wouldn't have the nerve. He then asserted that since Caleb was his, every inch of him belonged to him. A playful smile returned as his fingers lightly flicked a sensitive part of Caleb's body, adding that this, too, was his property. A tremor ran through Caleb, his body going rigid. He managed to choke out his understanding. Julian's final command was a death order. Caleb was forbidden from setting foot in places of ill repute again. Caleb, now naked and serious, knelt formally and swore his obedience. Julian then mentioned the lingering scent of the club on him and told him to go wash. Only then did Caleb realize the hot water his master had ordered earlier had been for him. He walked towards the bathroom, discreetly sniffing his own skin. He smelled only traces of perfume, nothing more. It seemed his master had a dislike for perfume. In the training room, Leo was complaining loudly about the unfairness of the situation. He felt it was a mutual agreement, and since Caleb had also failed to gather intel, he couldn't understand why he was the only one being punished. He lamented that Julian had changed. Leo was lying face down on a massage table, his back covered in angry red welts from the disciplinary session. Caleb paused in his application of soothing cream, lost in thought. Julian certainly was different lately. He would never have allowed someone to bathe in his private suite before, much less watch with such focused interest, giving orders to scrub harder, questioning if his skin was dirty or just naturally dark. The memory made Caleb's face burn, and he accidentally applied too much pressure. Leo hissed in pain, jerking away. Caleb quickly withdrew his hand, apologizing. Leo shot him a resentful glare, accusing him of bad-mouthing him to Julian. He called Caleb two-faced, appearing honest but secretly being treacherous. Caleb responded sternly that the rules of their unit were absolute. Leo had shirked his duty, and 30 lashes was a lenient punishment. Leo pouted, pointing out Caleb's own involvement. Caleb pressed his lips together, choosing not to explain. He suspected he knew why Julian hadn't punished him, but he feared Leo's jealousy if he spoke the truth. Of the 12 members of the security detail, Caleb was the only one Julian ever called his dog. Unique meant irreplaceable. The thought brought an involuntary smile to his face. Leo demanded to know what he was smiling about, taking it as confirmation of his guilt. He accused Caleb of betrayal, lunging at him playfully despite his injuries. The door swung open. It was the head of their detail, the man they all called Chief. At that moment, Leo was tugging at Caleb's shirt, playfully punching his chest. Chief cleared his throat awkwardly. Leo immediately began to whine, asking the Chief to stand up for him. A cool voice from behind the Chief cut him off, asking what exactly he wanted the Chief to do for him. Leo froze. Julian stepped into the room, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit. His eyes, narrowed and cold, swept over Leo, who was hastily trying to adjust his pants before finally landing on Caleb. His voice was like ice as he asked what they were doing. Caleb's heart pounded. He knew Julian was angry, though he didn't know why. His instincts took over and he dropped to his knees. He explained that he was applying cream to Leo's injuries. Julian gave a humorless laugh, questioning if Leo had lost the use of his hands. Caleb thought for a moment before replying that Leo did have hands. Julian's voice dropped, suggesting that in that case, Leo's hands were redundant. Leo yelped in protest, but a single glance from Julian silenced him. Julian ordered the Chief and Leo to leave. As the Chief helped a limping Leo out of the room, Julian knelt in front of Caleb, lifting his chin. He asked if Caleb was always this close with Leo. Caleb replied that they were brothers, men who would die for each other. Julian repeated the phrase slowly, his fingers methodically straightening Caleb's disheveled shirt. Then he asked, and what of his relationship with him? Caleb's answer was immediate. He was his master's dog, loyal until death. Julian stared at him, his expression unreadable, before finally sighing and conceding that Caleb was, indeed, correct. A few days later, Caleb was moved to a private room. That night, he retrieved a small lockbox from under his bed. Inside were his treasures, worthless to anyone else but priceless to him. He took out a small lock of dark hair he had collected over several months, carefully wrapping it in a silk handkerchief before placing it in the box. Later, on duty, he was perched in a discreet observation post overlooking Julian's private library. His eyes kept drifting to the figure on the couch below. Julian was reading, a turn of the page revealing a pale, elegant wrist. The attendants, Clara and Felix, were nearby. Caleb often envied them their proximity to his master. But he knew he lacked the sharp intellect required for such a personal role. His purpose was to be a dog to follow orders. Julian set aside his reading and dismissed the staff. Before he could even summon him, Caleb appeared, kneeling before him. Julian held out a half-eaten piece of expensive pastry, saying he was tired of it and that Caleb should have it. Stunned, Caleb opened his mouth. Julian placed the pastry inside, his fingertips inevitably brushing against Caleb's lips. Caleb chewed mechanically, the sweet taste of almond filling his mouth, mingled with a faint, personal scent from his master's skin. Julian glanced at the dusting of powdered sugar on his finger and, with a startlingly casual gesture, licked it clean. Caleb's throat constricted, and he almost choked. A glass of water was offered, and he took it gratefully. Julian watched him, a faint smile playing on his lips. He then informed Caleb about the upcoming dedication of the new Zenith Tower. The governor wanted a public celebration on the day of the vernal equinox, and it was said the view from the top encompassed the entire city. He told Caleb that if he wanted to see it, he could pose as a regular security agent and accompany him. Caleb, suppressing his excitement, agreed immediately. Then Julian's tone shifted. He asked if Caleb had ever thought of a life for himself, of building a reputation. He reminded Caleb that when he had first taken him in, he had sent him directly to the security training program without asking what he truly wanted. Now, Caleb was forced to live in the shadows. He spoke of the ambitions of other men, fame, fortune, power, and asked if Caleb had ever desired such things. Caleb's answer was unwavering. He only wanted to follow his master, to be his dog. Julian chuckled softly. He said he understood the conditioning of the training program. He instructed Caleb to simply stay by his side during the event and worry about nothing else. Leaving the study with the remaining pastries, Caleb pondered Julian's words, but couldn't make sense of them. Leo appeared out of nowhere, exclaiming over the pastries. Caleb quickly sidestepped him, inventing a lie that the master had said they were for him alone. Leo grumbled under his breath about how well Julian treated him. Back in his room, Caleb ate the rest of the pastries. They were sweet and rich, but they lacked the flavor of the one he had eaten in the study. Something was missing. The Zenith Tower was ablaze with light, surrounded by a throng of spectators. Caleb stayed close to Julian as they ascended to the rooftop observatory. Dancers moved gracefully to the music of a string quartet. Julian, holding a glass of champagne, smiled and asked if Caleb thought they were beautiful. Caleb admitted they were, though he was not observing their dance but their movements, their posture. They didn't carry themselves like performers. They looked more like, before he could finish the thought, a glass slammed onto a table. Julian's smile was gone. He snapped at Caleb, asking if he was blind to his empty glass, his attention stolen by the dancers. Caleb immediately apologized, realizing his mistake. On a rare occasion when he was allowed to serve his master personally, he had allowed himself to be distracted. For the rest of the evening, his focus was solely on Julian. He anticipated every need, refilling his drink, offering him hors d'oeuvres, ready for any command. He was completely absorbed in his duty. The attack was sudden. The dancers produced thin, sharp blades from their sleeves, their targets clear, Julian and the governor. The rooftop erupted into chaos. Caleb drew his weapon, forming a shield in front of Julian. Amid the flashing steel, several silent projectiles shot from the night sky. Looking up, Caleb saw a dark figure on a large, sophisticated drone, armed with a crossbow. The governor's main security was already moving him towards the safety of the indoor lounge. Caleb urged Julian to follow, but Julian's face was grim. He stated that it might not be safe there either. Caleb didn't question it. He tightened his grip on his weapon, ready to defend his master from any threat. Suddenly, Julian tackled him to the ground. Caleb felt his master's weight on top of him, his hair brushing against his face, the familiar cold scent filling his senses. Before he could process what was happening, an explosion rocked the building. Instinct took over. He flipped them over, shielding Julian with his own body. He frantically asked if he was all right. Julian assured him he was fine. The drone operator was carrying explosives. The tower's rooftop lounge was now a wreck, the blast having thrown the governor to the ground just as he was about to enter. He was uninjured, saved by his bodyguards. The dancers were being subdued, but the drone operator began dropping more small explosives. The tower shuddered, and screams rose from the streets below. This couldn't continue. Caleb uncoiled a lightweight grappling hook from his belt and launched it towards the drone. He knelt on the floor of the secure room, uneasy. The look on Julian's face after the incident suggested he had done something wrong. The governor, seated and composed, asked for his name. Before Caleb could speak, Julian answered for him. He said his name was Caleb Thorne, and he was part of his personal detail. Caleb stared at Julian. Thorn was the surname he had been given as a child, a name he had abandoned when he entered the program. He was surprised Julian even remembered it. The governor's eyes narrowed. He mused that the drone was out of range for standard firearms, yet this man had brought it down with a simple grappling hook and had also saved him from a poison dart. He remarked on the impressive talent within Julian's security team. The words were praise, but Caleb frowned. He felt he had created a problem for his master. As he had pulled down the drone and the operator was captured, Caleb had noticed something odd about the man's mouth. Just as everyone relaxed, the man had spat a tiny poison dart straight at the governor. Without thinking, Caleb had deflected it with his sidearm. When he looked back, he saw Julian's expression harden, though he said nothing. As the tension in the room thickened, Senator Sterling stepped forward. He declared that Caleb was a man of extraordinary talent, wasted as a simple bodyguard. He suggested that on a day when he had performed such a heroic act in front of so many citizens, it would be a fine political move for the governor to reward him with an official commission. It would show that the administration recognized and promoted talent. The governor agreed, asking what position Sterling had in mind. Sterling smiled, noting that the position of chief of the governor's security detail happened to be vacant. Caleb's mind went blank. He couldn't hear the rest of their conversation. He didn't want to be chief of security. He didn't want to leave Julian. He kept glancing at his master, but Julian's gaze was fixed on the floor, his face a mask. The governor's voice, sharp and commanding, broke through his daze. He asked if Caleb was unwilling. Sterling prompted him to accept the honor. It was the name Thorn that snapped him back to reality. He looked at the official commission papers being held out to him. He started to refuse, but at that exact moment, Julian finally spoke. His voice was cold as he remarked that Caleb must be overwhelmed with joy to leap from a private bodyguard to chief of security. Caleb looked up, shocked, only to be met with a humorless smile. Julian told him to stop looking at him and accept the appointment. His voice thick with a feeling he couldn't name, Caleb thanked the governor. The governor provided him with a new apartment and ordered him to move immediately. On the ride back to the penthouse to collect his things, he shared the armored car with Julian. He swallowed the bitter lump in his throat and said nothing. Julian didn't want him anymore. He was no longer his dog. As he spiraled into self-pity, a sharp pain blossomed on his cheek. Julian was pinching his face, his tone annoyed as he asked if Caleb had heard a word he'd said. Caleb sniffled, admitting he hadn't, and asked for punishment. Julian sighed, his hands cupping Caleb's face. He said it was his own fault for only thinking of showing Caleb the view. In the close confines of the car, Caleb could feel the warmth of Julian's breath, scented with something like gardenias. Suddenly, Julian's grip tightened painfully. He hissed that Caleb dared to be distracted in his presence, even after his new promotion. Caleb gasped that he was sorry. Julian relaxed his grip slightly. He explained that while he hadn't expected Sterling to try and recruit him, the situation worked perfectly for his own plans. He told Caleb that Sterling would approach him within a few days, and Caleb was to follow his instructions precisely. After Julian laid out the plan, a question arose in Caleb's mind. He asked if the assassins had been Julian's people. Julian looked at him with something akin to approval. He confirmed that he knew the man had a poison dart in his mouth, and that he hadn't wanted anyone to stop it. However, the assassins were not his. He clarified that while his father was a weak governor, he had no intention of patricide. He had simply known that the poison on the dart was a slow-acting neurotoxin, not immediately fatal. And he had intended to use the governor's incapacitation to launch a full investigation into Sterling without interference. He had not, however, anticipated Caleb's intervention. So that was the truth. Caleb nodded, a deep sense of guilt washing over him. He confessed that his rashness had ruined his master's plan. Julian leaned closer, his breath warm against Caleb's ear. He suggested that Caleb had more important things to worry about. Caleb, flustered, admitted he didn't understand. Julian explained that the governor was a paranoid man. With Caleb coming from Julian's personal detail, it was now too risky for them to be seen together, for both their sakes. Caleb suggested he could use his skills to sneak into the penthouse at night. Julian laughed softly. And what would he do, coming to his master in the middle of the night? He asked if perhaps Caleb was looking to. His fingertip traced the line of Caleb's Adam's apple, and his lips, barely moving, uttered the final suggestive word. Just as Julian predicted, Senator Sterling paid him a visit a few days later. He began with pleasantries before getting to the point. He said he had seen how Julian treated Caleb at the Tower Gala. Even though Caleb held a respectable position, Julian had made him perform the tasks of a common servant. Sterling lamented that a man of Caleb's talent shouldn't be subjected to such indignity. He congratulated Caleb on his new position as chief of security, a high rank not far below the head of Julian's own detail, and promised him a future of power and prestige. As Sterling talked, Caleb's hands clenched into fists. A murderous rage simmered just beneath the surface. He didn't understand all of Sterling's political maneuvering, but he could feel the thinly veiled contempt for Julian in his words. Julian was his master, the one line that could never be crossed. Sterling noticed his change in demeanor and asked if he had said something wrong. Caleb forced himself to relax his jaw. He told Sterling that he was not wrong. In fact, it was the truth of his words that had brought back unpleasant memories. Sterling smiled, satisfied. He remarked that it was no surprise Julian failed to inspire true loyalty. Caleb followed Julian's instructions, giving vague, non-committal answers. Only after Sterling left did the rage inside him begin to subside. For a while, the only time Caleb saw Julian was from a distance during official government briefings. He longed to approach him, to speak with him, even just to hear him call him a dog again. That was the only way he knew for sure that he still belonged to him. He thought about going to the penthouse but couldn't think of a valid reason. His new superior, Marcus, the commander of the governor's guard, kept him buried in work. Marcus claimed that since Caleb was favored by the governor, he had to carry a heavier burden. Failure to complete tasks resulted in punishment, but Caleb didn't care. Marcus would sneer that he wasn't surprised someone from Julian's detail couldn't handle the pressure, and that perhaps Senator Sterling had misjudged him. Caleb refused to bring shame to his master, so he completed every assignment flawlessly. Leo visited him once. After hearing about Marcus, he arranged for the man to run into some bad luck. A week ago, Marcus's gambling debts had become a public scandal. The day before, he had mysteriously fallen and broken his leg. Now, he was too preoccupied to bother Caleb. Caleb lay on his bed, the window open to the clear, moonlit sky. He held a white silk handkerchief to his face, inhaling the faint but distinct cold scent that clung to it. The next morning, he washed the handkerchief and hung it to dry. The scent was gone, and he felt a pang of regret as he noticed a loose thread. He carefully placed it back in his lockbox. After much deliberation, he went to the penthouse. Clara, one of Julian's personal assistants, met him at the door. It was the first time she had seen him up close, though he had watched her from the shadows for years, envying her position. He was told that Julian and Felix were out. After a moment of disappointment, he asked if she knew what kind of cologne Julian used. Clara seemed hesitant, explaining that the household used many different fragrances, but Julian's favorite was one called Ethel. When he asked what that was, she explained it was a custom blend, a complex and subtle scent made with rare ingredients. She was about to list them when he cut her off, asking where he could buy it. She replied that it was made exclusively for Julian by a private perfumer and was not available for sale. He asked if she could spare him some, knowing it was an inappropriate request. But the scent was gone from his handkerchief. She apologized, saying she couldn't make that decision. Only Julian could authorize it. Defeated, Caleb returned to his apartment. The inquiry about the cologne had been the only excuse he could invent. He had failed to see Julian and failed to get the scent. He walked the city streets aimlessly until dusk. As he entered his apartment, he knew something was wrong. A light was on in his bedroom. He lived alone, preferring no staff. He drew his weapon and moved silently down the hall. Before he could reach it, the door opened. A familiar, amused voice remarked that the chief had certainly kept him waiting. His weapon clattered to the floor. For a moment, he was frozen, a mixture of shock and overwhelming joy washing over him. Julian had come to see him. He could smell the faint, cold fragrance in the air. Julian relayed what Clara had told him, teasingly asking if Caleb had been that sad to miss him. In Julian's presence, Caleb couldn't lie. He mumbled an affirmation. Then he quietly added that Julian could just call him Seven. Julian raised an eyebrow, asking if being chief of security wasn't enough for him, that he still longed to be a shadow. He mentioned that he had heard of Caleb's performance at the Capitol, and that he was truly worthy of his title. When Caleb remained silent, Julian cupped his face, studying him closely. He murmured that Caleb had lost weight and asked if work was difficult. Caleb shook his head. Julian continued, saying he knew Marcus gave him all the unpleasant jobs, and asked why Caleb didn't fight back. Caleb replied that he wasn't afraid of hard work. Julian's voice softened. He said he couldn't stand to see Caleb mistreated. The genuine concern in his master's eyes made Caleb's heart ache. He promised he wouldn't let Julian worry again. Julian squeezed his cheek gently, calling him good. Caleb had grown accustomed to these affectionate gestures and words, which had started after the mission at the club. A mischievous glint appeared in Julian's eyes. He asked Caleb to guess what he had found. Caleb shook his head in confusion. A second later, Julian produced the lockbox from behind his back. The simple combination lock was open. Caleb's blood ran cold. Julian opened the box and began to name the contents. The obsidian cufflinks, the coral tie clip, the crystal paperweight, the onyx worry stone, all gifts from him. But the simple wooden comb, the worn leather key fob, the dried apricot pit, the silk handkerchief, and even the lock of hair, he said he didn't recall giving him those. Faced with Julian's questioning, Caleb lowered his head, a hot flush of shame creeping up his neck. Julian asked him to explain why he was hoarding such trinkets. Caleb stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. Julian didn't press him. He picked up the handkerchief. Caleb's eyes darted around, wishing Julian would put it down, muttering that it was dirty. But Julian examined it closely. After a few moments, he gave a knowing smile. He asked why Caleb would keep it in his special box if it was dirty. For the first time, Caleb truly understood the desire to simply cease existing. Julian didn't push further. He simply said he had plenty of those handkerchiefs, and if Caleb wanted more, he would have Leo bring them over. Before he left, Julian placed a small, elegant box on the table. It contained the ethyl cologne Caleb had so desperately wanted. But he felt no joy. That night, he was consumed by the shame of his secret obsession being exposed. He should have used a better lock. 2 years passed. Caleb never grew accustomed to his new life. He missed everything about the penthouse, every corner, every shadow where he had once hidden, watching his master. A month ago, a new agent had been assigned to the security detail, filling his old position. His designation was also 7. When Caleb heard the news, he drank alcohol for the first time in his life. He couldn't stop wondering if he was still Julian's only dog. Did Julian call the new man his dog, too? Leo drank with him, not understanding the cause of his misery, and would have dismissed it as just a call sign anyway. Only Caleb knew how much that name meant. Julian noticed his dark mood, but Caleb, of course, said nothing. To his astonishment, Julian seemed to read his mind. He told Caleb he would change the new agent's designation. He even promised him, "The name 7 will always be reserved for you, even if you can never officially be my guard again." The first snow fell, blanketing the city in white. An aide reported that all arrangements were in place for the winter retreat. Caleb nodded and continued his patrol. This year's security for the governor's annual hunting trip was his responsibility. Normally, Marcus handled it, but Marcus was one of Sterling's men. Julian had said Marcus was too arrogant and incompetent to be useful for long, and Sterling would eventually replace him. Following Julian's plan, Caleb had earned Sterling's trust. Now, both Sterling and the governor relied on him. Not long ago, Marcus had picked a fight with him, accusing him of insubordination. Marcus ended up with 3 broken ribs and a fractured arm. The governor, instead of punishing Caleb, had reprimanded Marcus. With Marcus on medical leave, Caleb was temporarily in charge. The falling snow stirred memories. The last time he had attended this retreat was 3 years ago. He had been hidden in the snow-laden branches of a pine tree, watching Julian, dressed in hunting gear, ride with breathtaking grace, his every move a display of effortless power. Caleb had thought then how wonderful it would be to ride alongside him. Perhaps today was the day. With his duties temporarily settled, he spurred his horse into the forest. He found Julian alone. Julian asked why he wasn't with the governor, that his father would be displeased. Caleb explained he had already assigned men to the governor's protection. Julian's own attendants were nowhere in sight. Surrounded by the silent, snow-covered trees, it was just the 2 of them. Julian drew his bow, taking aim at a deer. The arrow flew and the animal fell. As Julian moved to retrieve his prize, Caleb stopped him. His master's hand was injured. A sharp fletching had sliced his finger, and a bead of blood was welling up. Julian smiled and held out his hand. Caleb expertly took the finger into his mouth. Julian had once told him that saliva had antiseptic properties, and Caleb had since become his personal source. Julian's skin was as delicate as fine silk, easily damaged. Caleb gently released the finger, the faint taste of his master lingering in his mouth. As he was about to remount his horse, Julian did something unexpected. He unbuckled his belt, revealing a flash of pale skin. He stammered his master's name, asking what he was doing. Julian explained that his riding gear had chafed his skin. He suggested that since Caleb had already tended to his finger, he might as well treat this injury too. The snow fell, its white almost indistinguishable from the skin revealed to him, except for the angry red mark that stood out like a winter blossom. He asked if the chief was unwilling. Caleb swallowed hard, his voice thick as he replied that he was willing. A voice, urgent and frantic, called his name through the darkness. "Caleb, "Wake up. Don't sleep." He groaned, forcing his eyes open. The warm body in his arms brought him back to reality. He asked if Julian was hurt. Julian replied that he was fine, then called him a fool. A small avalanche of rock and snow had come down the mountain. A shallow alcove in the rock face had offered just enough space for two. Without thinking, Caleb had thrown himself over Julian, shielding him as they huddled inside. Now, his back was pressed against the heavy rockfall, trapping them together. The dull, grinding pain in his back made him clench his jaw. His eyelids felt heavy, and a deep cold was seeping into him. He apologized to his master, admitting he had failed in his duty. The safety of the retreat had been his responsibility, and he had not foreseen the danger of an avalanche. Julian told him to save his strength and not to speak. A hand touched his face, then moved to his shoulder and back. He could feel Julian trembling. The voice in his ear was strained, desperate. The Julian he knew was always composed, always in control, but now he seemed to have lost his composure. Caleb tried to say something, but he had no strength left. As consciousness faded, the cold scent grew stronger, and he realized his head was resting on Julian's shoulder. "I forbid you to sleep. Open your eyes. Do you hear me, Caleb?" The commands grew distant. He tried to obey, but this time he couldn't. He had a dream. In the dream, it was just him and Julian. It was a strange, hazy dream, yet it felt real. In a snow-covered forest, he was pressed against a tree. Julian's hands moved over him, his voice a low curse as he called him a dog. Just as Caleb's secret hopes began to rise, Julian pulled back, tossing a white silk handkerchief at his face. His eyes were full of playful cruelty, his voice light as he told Caleb to take care of it himself. And then the dream ended. When he woke, a nurse was sitting by his bed. As she moved to report that he was awake, he rasped a question, asking if Julian was unharmed. The nurse assured him that His Highness was fine. He felt a wave of relief, followed by a strange sense of disappointment. Perhaps Julian had visited while he was unconscious. He waited expectantly for the nurse to bring his master. Instead, an entirely different person entered. It was Mr. Harrison, the governor's chief of staff, his face fixed in its usual polite smile. In his hands, he held an official-looking document. He commended Caleb for his bravery in protecting Julian in such a perilous situation, then sighed dramatically. He said it was a shame that he had saved Julian, but Julian had. Harrison trailed off, shaking his head. Caleb demanded to know what he meant. Harrison demurred, saying it wasn't his place, and unrolled the document. He said the orders had been in his possession for several days, waiting for Caleb to wake up. Confused, Caleb pushed himself up and knelt on the floor. After Harrison finished reading, Caleb's brow was deeply furrowed. He was no longer chief but Lieutenant Thorne, reassigned. He was to accept the transfer. He asked urgently if Julian knew about this. The order stated that due to his negligence, which had led to Julian being endangered, the governor was demoting him and reassigning him to a remote county in the Northern Territories. He accepted the blame, but the Northern Territories were 1,000 miles away. If he went, he might never see Julian again. Harrison confirmed that Julian was fully aware. He leaned in conspiratorially, saying that while Caleb's actions were heroic, and the negligence could have been overlooked, Julian himself had gone before the governor and accused him not only of dereliction of duty, but of other, more serious transgressions. He advised Caleb to think about any financial or moral indiscretions he might have committed. In short, Julian had pressed the matter until the governor had no choice. Caleb accepted the transfer papers, remaining on his knees long after Harrison had left. The indiscretions Harrison mentioned were real, but they had been part of the plan to gain Sterling's trust, all with Julian's knowledge and approval. Could it be true that Julian had demanded this? There was only one way to find out. As he stepped out of the building, he found Marcus and a squad of guards waiting for him. Marcus's arm was still in a sling. He asked where Lieutenant Thorne thought he was going. Caleb told him to get out of his way. Marcus sneered, saying he was there to deliver a message from Julian. The order was to depart for the Northern Territories immediately. Caleb clenched his fists, his knuckles cracking. Marcus took a step back, a flicker of fear in his eyes. He said if Caleb didn't believe him, he should look at what he had. He tossed a small object to Caleb. It was Julian's personal signet ring. In that instant, Caleb's heart felt as if it had been torn open. A sharp, bitter pain spread through his chest, making it impossible to breathe, let alone speak. It was true. He must have done something to anger his master. Behind him, Marcus's triumphant laughter echoed, but Caleb barely heard it. He left the city alone, carrying only his new commission papers. The sky was full of stars. He pulled on the reins, and his horse came to a stop. The guards who had been tailing him were gone. He had had time to think on the road. Julian was brilliant, a master strategist. There had to be a reason for this. But no matter how hard he thought, he couldn't understand it. He would go back and demand an answer. But as he turned his horse around, he sensed another presence. "Who's there?" he called out, a throwing knife already in his hand. A figure dropped from the trees, catching the knife with a laugh. "The boss really knows you," the man said. "He knew your thick skull would try to go back." It was Leo. Caleb looked around eagerly, asking if Julian was there too. Leo told him not to bother. Julian was too busy. He was there to stop Caleb from returning to the city. Caleb's face fell. He asked why. Leo seemed exasperated. He asked if Caleb had any idea what he'd said while he was unconscious. Caleb could only remember the dream. A dreadful thought occurred to him. He mumbled that he didn't remember. Leo told him he had been calling out Julian's name over and over, in a tone that could only be described as pathetic. And just his luck, Senator Sterling had been there to hear it. Caleb scratched his head, still not understanding what that had to do with his demotion. Leo explained that after 2 years of earning Sterling's trust, Caleb had revealed his devotion to Julian in his delirium. It wouldn't take long for a man like Sterling to figure things out, and his first move would be to eliminate Caleb. He explained that while the governor didn't yet know what Sterling had heard, the senator would surely twist the story and poison the governor's mind against him. The governor, while not competent, was the most suspicious man alive. He would not tolerate one of his top security chiefs having a secret loyalty to his son. Julian, with his foresight, had acted first, getting Caleb out of the city and beyond their reach. Caleb asked if this meant Julian was now in danger. Leo assured him not to worry. The 12 of them were still there to protect him, and Julian was always 10 steps ahead. Of course, even without him, Julian had others. Seeing Caleb's crestfallen face, Leo held up a letter and a small package. Caleb snatched them from his hand. Leo tried to peer over his shoulder, complaining that Julian was being secretive with everyone lately. Caleb turned his back on him and carefully opened the letter. Julian's handwriting was elegant and sharp. He read the words, committing them to memory. Julian told him to be a good county lieutenant and not to worry about the city. When the time came for him to take power, that would be the day Caleb would return. Caleb folded the letter and opened the package. Inside, besides a thick stack of cash, were dozens of white silk handkerchiefs. Under Leo's curious gaze, Caleb quickly repacked everything and swung himself onto his horse. He told Leo to go back and tell Julian that Seven understood. In his third year in the North, news arrived that Senator Sterling had been executed. The list of his crimes was long, including masterminding the assassination attempt at the Zenith Tower. That had been the final straw for the governor. Marcus, though not part of the assassination plot, had been deeply involved in Sterling's other criminal activities and had also been dealt with. Caleb looked out at the falling snow, took a sip of tea, and returned to his paperwork. The northern winters were colder than in the city, and the snow had been falling for months. On a rare clear day, an unexpected visitor arrived at the small county office. The local officials knelt, glancing nervously at Caleb, as if seeking an explanation. After accepting the official decree, Caleb thanked the envoy. It was Felix who quickly told General Thorne to rise. The past 3 years had crawled by. By day, he buried himself in his work, but at night, his thoughts always returned to the city, to Julian. He wondered if his master ever thought of him, even for a moment. He wondered if he remembered his promise. Now Felix was here. Julian had kept his word. That night, the town officials held a celebration to congratulate him on his appointment to commander of the Federal Guard. It was the second time in his life he had drunk alcohol. He rode hard, leaving Felix and his entourage far behind. But when he reached the capital, he heard that Julian was getting married. The city streets were buzzing with the news. People marveled that Julian was so in love that he would hold his wedding before his own coronation. They said that on the very day the old governor died, Julian had set the date, unable to wait a single moment. They wondered about the identity of the woman who had captured his heart so completely. So, the governor had passed away shortly after Felix had left for the north. And Julian's first act was not to take power, but to marry. He gripped the reins tightly. Julian must love this woman very much. A master's happiness was a good thing. His children would be Caleb's new, young masters. If they looked anything like Julian, they would be beautiful. The thought brought a small smile to his lips. He glanced down at the small, carved box in his coat and spurred his horse towards the government palace. It was twilight, but Julian was nowhere to be seen. A maid led him to a private suite and instructed him to bathe and change. After weeks on the road, a wash was certainly in order. He didn't question why they dressed him in a formal red suit and placed an ornate, jeweled coronet on his head. All he could think about was that he was about to see his master again. The bedroom was lit by dozens of candles. Julian sat on the edge of the large bed, dressed in magnificent red ceremonial robes that seemed to make all other colors in the world fade. 3 years had not changed him. His eyes still held that captivating, dangerous allure. Caleb had so much to say, but now, faced with him, the words wouldn't come. Julian spoke first, his voice a low command. "Come here." Caleb suppressed the tremor of excitement in his chest and moved forward on his knees. An elegant, bare foot lifted his chin. He swallowed hard. Julian's voice was a low murmur, asking if Caleb wished to serve him. Though he didn't understand the timing of the question, Caleb's response was honest. He did. Julian leaned down, patting his cheek. He reminded Caleb that he was just a dog, a pet, and questioned if he was worthy. A familiar wave of disappointment washed over Caleb. But then, Julian's languid voice cut through the silence again, amending his statement. He would allow it. Caleb's head snapped up, his heart pounding with joy. He was back, and he could serve his master again. He tried to compose himself, presenting the carved box he carried. Inside was an exquisite jade comb he had carved himself, a skill he had learned from a craftsman in his small northern town. He had touched his master's silken hair a few times, had even kept some of it. He had wanted to give him a comb for years but never had a reason. Now, with his marriage, he finally did. Julian took the box and asked if this was his wedding gift to him. A dowry. Confused, Caleb said it was a congratulatory gift for his marriage to his new bride, wishing them a long and happy life together. In an instant, Julian's expression turned to stone. The playful glint in his eyes vanished. He said that after 3 years, he had thought Caleb might have come to understand his own heart, but now he saw he had overestimated him. Hearing the sudden chill in his master's voice, Caleb quickly bowed his head, offering to prepare a different gift if this one was unsatisfactory. Julian was silent for a moment, then let out a cold, harsh laugh. The next thing Caleb knew, a foot had sent him sprawling to the floor. "You wanted to serve me, didn't you?" Julian's voice was laced with fury. "You unobservant dog. Get over here and serve me." Something landed beside him. It was a jar of scented oil. Julian was clearly still angry. "Serve me well," he warned, "and if you dare to hurt me, I'll have you sent to the surgeons." In that moment, everything became clear. He opened his mouth, wanting to ask why, but all the pieces suddenly fell into place. The special treatment, the intimate touches, the jealousy. It all made sense now. And his own feelings over the past 3 years, his constant longing, his obsession with Julian's scent and his possessions. Even using a lock of his hair for comfort. His loyalty was not so pure after all. His heart was beating with a force he had never felt before. He fought to control his breathing as he removed his shoes and climbed onto the bed. The morning sun streamed into the room. Julian, stripped of his usual composure, rested against Caleb's chest. Caleb gently combed his master's long, dark hair with the jade comb, again and again, reciting the words Julian had taught him through the night. First, to comb for a life together. Second, to comb for mutual respect. It all felt like a dream, but he could clearly remember the shimmering light in Julian's eyes, the flush on his cheeks, and the words he had whispered against his ear. "Do you want to marry me?" he had asked. Caleb had replied that he wanted to, but he was just his master's dog, unworthy. Julian had laughed softly, his voice husky and warm. "Then I suppose I'll have to marry a dog." Lately, a new pastry had become popular in the capital's bakeries, the Long John. It caused quite a stir, because unlike a traditional éclair, this new version was as wide as a baby's fist and nearly 7 inches long. Its color was also an unusual deep black. Customers who tried it were amazed to find that the filling was not the traditional cream, but a rich, sweetened mascarpone, and the dark pastry was made with black sesame flour. Every bakery claimed that their Long John was the most authentic, the same kind enjoyed by the powerful man in the governor's palace. Caleb stood in the main congressional hall, discussing the upcoming visit of a foreign delegation with a group of senators. The governor, Julian, sat languidly on the high-backed chair, his gaze occasionally and deliberately drifting over to Caleb. Caleb straightened his back, trying to focus. A senator was asking him about security deployments in the busy southern district. General Thorne? General Thorne? The senator's voice cut through his thoughts. He realized the entire room was looking at him. The silence was heavy. He was about to apologize when a soft chuckle came from the governor's chair. "It seems General Thorne has exhausted himself arranging the city's security. Perhaps we should adjourn for today." Besides, Julian added, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear, "I find myself craving a Long John." A ripple went through the room. It was well known that the governor was fond of the pastry. The senators quickly agreed that if the governor wished for a snack, they shouldn't keep him. As the room emptied, Caleb remained where he was. In the past, he would have dutifully gone to the kitchens to fetch the pastry. But since that night, he had learned that sometimes a Long John was not just a Long John. He met the teasing, expectant gaze of his master and stammered, I'll go prepare it at once."